couple of weeks ago, I published a long-term review of this, the 16-inch MacBook Pro. Now for this channel, that video has really taken off. It's had tens of thousands of views. If you've watched it, subscribed as a result of it, or commented or whatever, liked it, thank you so much. I really genuinely did not expect that video to be that popular. And there's one really simple reason for that. Apple has just announced their M1 chip, which is their own CPU, which will replace Intel, and it will be making its way to this laptop pretty soon. That said, the speed with which people watched my video and the feedback I've had from it kind of proves that there's still a place for this machine, and I think that is likely to be the case for quite a while. And during my time with this computer, I have learned 5 things which I think you'll need to know before you buy. Welcome back to Ellis Reviews. Thanks for subscribing and liking and doing everything you've done over the last couple of months. It has been fantastic. I'm loving the way the channel is growing. If you haven't subscribed yet, click below. This is my 16-inch MacBook Pro that I bought in 2019. I love it. Hands down, the best computer I have owned. It's an absolute monster. Power-wise, I went for a pretty top spec, as you can see in my previous review, but it's not without its faults. That said, I still think, even with the M1 Mac now here pretty much, that it's still a really good buy. But there are 5 things I've learned which I think anyone considering this laptop needs to be aware of. So if you're on the fence, or Apple's announcement this week has kind of made you second think your decision to buy the 16-inch MacBook Pro, here are 5 things you absolutely need to know. The first one's quite simple. I think people clearly still want this laptop. Therefore, if you are thinking about buying the 16-inch MacBook, you're not alone. Before it came out, there were lots of rumours about it in terms of it having a different design, Face ID, all sorts of wacky things that they could have done with it. But typical Apple, they did pretty much nothing. In terms of the design, it's just the same MacBook we've been used to for the last 5 or 6 years. But the internals have been significantly bolstered. That said, it does get a lot of stick from non-Apple people, and I understand why. It's an incredibly expensive laptop. Mine was £3,500 UK pounds. That's a lot of money for a computer. And yes, you can buy or spec up PCs, as in Windows PCs, which are pretty much the same in terms of power, or even more powerful for less money. That has always been the case with Apple. But regardless of that, if you just want a powerful Mac, that's fine. And the fact that the 16-inch kind of fits the bill for you, I'd go for it. My next key learning is a bit frustrating, and it's portability. It's big. It's very difficult to get this over on a video, really, in terms of how big this thing is. If I compare it with, for example, the 12.9-inch iPad Pro, which is in the keyboard case in fairness here, you can see the size difference. For a long time, I was used to the 13-inch MacBook Pro, and that's incredibly portable. Before that, I had the 11-inch Air, which is tiny. But yeah, it does take some getting used to, and there are some problems with that. So for example, if you are the sort of person who goes out and does video editing on the go, or you just want a laptop that you can take to coffee shops to do work, it's a bit cumbersome for that. And it's not just the weight. I mean, the weight is there, definitely. You'll feel it in your backpack. It's the size of it. It's literally the physical dimensions. I have a couple of backpacks that it just doesn't fit in. That's annoying. Also, table space. You know, if you find yourself working on a small table in a coffee shop or a hotel or something, it takes up a lot of room. Therefore, if portability is something that you're really, really keen on having nailed down, it might be a bit big for you. That said, it is still a laptop, and it's designed to be portable. Just bear in mind it's big. What I'd recommend, if you're thinking about this and the size of it is bothering you, is just to go to an Apple store when you can and try it out. Get a feel for the size of it. Or actually, if you've used a 15-inch MacBook in the past, it's pretty much identical to that. So you can probably use your experience of that machine to gauge whether or not this is going to be too big for you. The fans. Now, one thing I hadn't taken into consideration with my previous video was just how big an issue the fans are. For not for everyone, but for a lot of people with this machine. I am going to do a separate video on this. I'm going to do a little bit of testing, just to give you an idea of how loud the fans are. But just to recap on the issue, I do a lot of video editing, obviously, on this machine, and I also do some music production as well. So I use Logic for the latter, and I use Final Cut Pro for video editing. Now, almost without question, whenever I use both of those apps, no matter what I'm doing, really, in fairness, whether I'm just doing light video editing, 4K editing, light music production, or really digging into very heavy plugins, the fans on this machine spin up pretty much straight away, and it gets very, very hot to the point where it's uncomfortable to hold it on your lap. Now, I've just kind of got used to that, and throughout the summer it did it more often than not. Certainly when the temperature, the ambient temperature was quite high, it was roasting, to be honest, and the fans were just constantly going when I was using these Pro apps. Now, I also believe, and I've not tested this, but I've seen the evidence of it in the comments on my last video, that if you connect this laptop to an external monitor, you get the same issue. The fans spin up and it gets very loud. Now, in my experience, the fan noise doesn't impact the performance of the machine. So, for example, if I'm using Logic Pro and I'm doing something relatively heavy in it, it still works like a dream. This is a very powerful computer. I've never had a computer this powerful that has so much headroom, and the fans blaring away in the background don't seem to impact the performance. Your mileage may vary, and there are people out there who have experienced this slightly differently, shall we say. They have had issues, but in my experience, the fans are just loud and it gets hot, and that's kind of it, really. For me, I've got used to it. I live in the UK, thankfully, which means the weather here is generally fairly useless and fairly cold, so ambient temperature isn't really a big issue, apart from for about 2 months of the year. But if you live in a very hot country, I can see it getting a bit annoying, actually. I think a lot of it is down to the thermals of this computer. It's packing a lot of stuff in here, and the previous generation didn't handle thermals very well at all. So they've done a lot in terms of making the body better to cope with heat. But clearly the fans are doing a lot of work, and if fan noise bothers you, firstly, make sure you subscribe, because I'm going to do a video on that at some stage. But just do a little bit of hunting around, because it has annoyed quite a lot of people. I think if you do intend on connecting this laptop to an external monitor, it may be an issue for you. Very quick one on the keyboard. Before this laptop came out, the keyboards on the MacBook Pros were horrendous, and I agree with that. My previous MacBook went through 2 keyboards. Horrible typing experience, no key travel, very noisy. Yeah, horrible. You don't realise quite how bad that keyboard was until you get one of these new keyboards. And obviously you now get the new keyboard on the Air, and I think also the 13-inch MacBook Pro, but the 16-inch was the first one to have this brand new keyboard mechanism. And it's great. Really, really, really lovely keyboard. If I go, for example, from the Magic Keyboard on my iMac to the 16-inch MacBook Pro, it's night and day, actually. I love typing on that MacBook. It's not too squashy, it's not too noisy. The other issue with the previous generation MacBook keyboard was that it broke down a lot. Like I say, I got through 2 keyboards on my last one. Now, touch wood, after over a year of use, I've not had any issues with this keyboard, and it feels as good as it was the day I bought it. It's gone a bit shiny because I type so much, but apart from that, it feels great. I haven't had no problems with keys coming off or not registering, and I think the general consensus out there is that they've fixed whatever that problem was with the previous keyboard. So if the keyboard is still on your mind about when you're considering buying this laptop, get rid of it. Get that out of your mind. There is no issue with the keyboard. It's a great keyboard. Lastly, the expense. Now, this is not a cheap laptop. I've said that several times. I bought it for my business. It's an investment for my business, and it's a good investment because I get an awful lot of productivity out of it, and it just works for me, and it will for thousands of other people. I think if you're a hobbyist, it's quite hard to justify. And if I take myself out of my business, if this was just a hobby, if what I do with my business was just a hobby, then I would have a hard time justifying spending $3,500 on a laptop. That's just me. You may be different. So I think really the expense, and it's more expensive than a PC equivalent. I get that completely. But I think if you are a Mac user, if you're in the Mac ecosystem like I am, there's lots of things that I do with Apple's ecosystem that, for example, transferring files via AirDrop. I'm completely into their app ecosystem. For me, it works, and I've been in that ecosystem for the last 4 or 5 years. So I'm paying a premium for this laptop and for this power, but it makes sense for my business. So I think the expense is justified if you're in that position, really, and if you're a pro. I think if you're a hobbyist user, it's tricky to justify. I think given the size of the laptop and the fact that you can get the 13-inch for a fair bit cheaper, to be honest, and the fact that we also have the M1 chip here now, I think unless you absolutely desperately need the computer now, I'd wait a little bit, because that M1 chip is going to end up in this 16-inch MacBook Pro at some stage. I would guess probably early next year. And when that happens, the world's your oyster. So pro, expense makes sense. That rhymes. Hobbyist, really think twice about how much you want to spend that money. Now, if desktops are more your thing, I think Apple has another machine which is still pretty relevant, and it is sat here in front of me. You can't see it at the moment, but I did do a long-term review of the 27-inch iMac very recently. So carry on watching to see a link to that video. And in the meantime, thanks so much for watching and subscribing. I will see you next time.